This video is sponsored by Incogni. After the American Civil War, the defeated South was put through a series of events collectively known as Reconstruction. Think of it as like rehab the South had to go through before they could be fully readmitted into the Union, but with a lot of unfortunate relapses at first. And along the way, and afterwards, it didn't go too well. Union troops established 5 military zones across the former Confederacy, and each state could rejoin the Union if they fulfilled the requirements of the Reconstruction Acts. Basically, passed the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, passed the 14th Amendment to grant equal protection under the law to everyone including the freed slaves, and passed the 15th Amendment to prohibit discrimination in voting rights based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Then the final major requirement was to pass a new state constitution acceptable to the majority of the state's citizens. While eventually these amendments were passed, the southern states tried many things to try and get around these new amendments to avoid having to accept these new changes. This actually led to some aspects of the Reconstruction Acts to be altered to negate these efforts. One example is how most of the white population of Mississippi collectively refused to vote to pass their new state constitution, so the federal government changed the wording of that requirement to where it required the majority of the voters, which let it pass. With these frictions, there was one occasion where the state of Arkansas had a very short civil war almost. While not anywhere close to the American Civil War they experienced a decade before, it still resulted in a Reconstruction-era blunder that ended up shaping Arkansas politics for nearly a century and contributed to the growing frustrations of Reconstruction altogether. But before we continue, here's a brief word about this video's sponsor, Incogni. These days, it seems like people's personal data and private information are more vulnerable than ever before on the internet. To make issues worse, even if you're able to fight to keep your privacy, the process can take forever and it seems to never get anywhere. Luckily, there is Incogni. Incogni is a service that speeds up the job of protecting your personal data by finding all of the groups using your data and doing the process of removing that data for you. You can even see ongoing progress on their website's dashboard and receive regular updates. I myself actually already had an Incogni account before this sponsorship, and they've been doing a great job protecting and removing my personal data, all from collection sites I didn't even know existed. It saved me an estimated 120 hours of work filling out remove requests if I decided to just do it all on my own. So I'm very satisfied with their service, and I bet you will be too. If you use the code TIGERSTAR with the link below, you can get 60% off an annual plan with Incogni. So take your personal data back with Incogni, and thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Across both the North and South, as well as both the Republican and Democratic parties, you had multiple factions arising out of response to these events. There were the Radical Republicans, a group that wanted harsher terms of Reconstruction to actively punish the South and demand for more policies to guarantee the equal rights of the freed slaves, compared to the moderate Republicans, who wanted to soften the process and prevent any possible re-sparking of conflict. As Reconstruction continued, some even thought the job was finished and any further measures would be too oppressive for former Confederates to the point of impacting their constitutional liberties, and these people would eventually call themselves liberal Republicans. Meanwhile, the Democrats remained somewhat sectionalized, with Northern Democrats mostly focusing on fiscal conservatism that would later be referred to as Bourbon Democrats, while most Southern Democrats would be referred to as Redeemer Democrats, a group that wanted to remove radical Republican policies and oust anyone who supported them, with the hopes of restoring the white supremacist order that existed across the South before the Civil War. With Redeemer Democrats being the main opposition to Republican-led Reconstruction efforts in the South, their targets aside from African Americans would be scalawags, local Southerners who supported Reconstruction, and carpetbaggers, Northerners who moved to the South during Reconstruction for jobs that were painted as opportunistic grifters. These factions fought each other through both political and in some cases violent ways, with the rise of groups such as the White League and, of course, the infamous Ku Klux Klan. In 1872, the Liberal Republican faction decided to run as their own party in the presidential elections, as well as several local gubernatorial elections. The Democratic Party decided to officially endorse the Liberal Republicans and their call for a less harsh Reconstruction. For the state of Arkansas's gubernatorial election, you had the Liberal Republican candidate Joseph Brooks running against Radical Republican candidate Elisha Baxter. Brooks' supporters were nicknamed Brindletails, while Baxter's supporters were nicknamed Minstrels, mainly for having the support of the black population, so yeah, real classy. US elections in the late 19th century had several problems with corrupt political machines that would cause irregularities in elections, and Arkansas was no exception. 3 whole counties in Arkansas had their results either rejected or never counted. One of them because their poll and registration books were stolen. Of the results that were counted, the Republicans under Elisha Baxter won with around 52% of the vote. Baxter was governor for, 2 years until the next election. Yeah, Arkansas gubernatorial terms were really short for some reason. But with the multiple irregularities, many of Brooks' supporters called fraud, and a legal battle over the election results began in 1873, which for the time being didn't go anywhere. But strangely, in Baxter's short time in office, he ended up being more moderate in his governing, which disappointed the radical Republicans. He then furthermore vetoed pro-Reconstruction bills such as the 1874 Railroad Steel Bill, while also supporting re-enfranchisement of former Confederate officials. By 1874, the so-called minstrels were now oddly supporting Brooks, while the so-called brindletails were now oddly supporting Baxter. But the spark of conflict would arise thanks to a judge sympathetic to Brooks' grievances with the 1872 election. Judge John Whitehawk decided to look over Brooks' legal case, but did so without Baxter or his lawyers present. Whitehawk decided to award Brooks $2,000 and the governorship of Arkansas, something he had no legal authority to do even if this was a proper trial. But Brooks took this as justification to seize the office. On April 15th of 1874, Brooks, along with 20 armed men, seized the Arkansas Capitol building in Little Rock, without resistance. Nearly 300 men joined him as the day went on. The state arsenal was seized, and they sent telegraphs to President Grant claiming they were now rightfully in charge, also requesting if they could borrow the nearby federal arsenal to support their claims. The two senators from Arkansas also informed Grant of their support for Brooks. Baxter, meanwhile, went to a 22-room hotel known as the Anthony House 3 blocks away from the state capitol with his own supporters. He denounced Brooks' treachery and also began telegraphing Grant for federal help. Violence briefly broke out in Little Rock, resulting in one person dying. This led to Brooks declaring martial law for Pulaski County. Over the next few days, there would be militias supporting each side, both led by ex-Confederate soldiers. Baxter's supporters notably found an abandoned Civil War-era cannon and decided to use it, nicknaming the cannon Lady Baxter. But ultimately, with the Republicans of the state divided and the state Democrats now supporting Baxter, Baxter's faction would end up outnumbering Brooks' forces and having the upper hand. While Little Rock was the biggest standoff, there were reported clashes across multiple Arkansas counties between supporters of each side. While Brooks had outside supporters, he ultimately lost favor as not only had he seized power by undemocratic and violent means, but also had supporters who kidnapped 2 Arkansas Supreme Court justices in nearby Memphis, Tennessee. They eventually escaped, and the Arkansas Supreme Court decided to take up Brooks' case after all, siding against him 3-1. President Grant also ultimately endorsed Baxter at his Attorney General's advice on May 15th, ending any hopes Brooks had for securing legitimacy. Brooks ultimately relented, with Baxter returning to the State House on the 19th. While this short conflict ended quickly, the consequences would be heavy for Arkansas. Arkansas agreed to adopt a new state constitution later that year in 1874, but the fight between the two Republican factions further soured their support in the state and broke their coalition. After Baxter's term ended in 1874, the Redeemer Democrats wasted no time in monopolizing power in the state. The next gubernatorial election resulted in an ex-Confederate politician named Augustus Garland to win unopposed, beginning an era of nearly 90 years of single-party Democratic rule in Arkansas that wouldn't be broken until 1965. Jim Crow laws were quickly implemented that disenfranchised the African American population during that time as well. Reconstruction would ultimately end with the final withdrawal of Union troops from the South by President Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877. But the Brooks-Baxter War was one of many signs that while Reconstruction had some good initial progress, it ultimately did not go as well as originally hoped. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.